Last year I made a video that said to avoid certain story structures because they were used too much, and I got a lot of pushback. That video got a lot of views, but the comments section was where it really lit up. I got a lot of authors saying, well, what about this book? Or they just plain disagreed with me. So this video will offer a few more story structures that are overused, and I'll also debate the authors who disagreed with me. Now, I did see a lot of comments like this one, but if 20 to 30% of authors think they are all the 0.01% of authors, they might be fooling themselves. And as always, I am just giving general principles. They are not hard and fast rules. But I would say that you'd be wise to at least considering them when you're crafting your novel. Now, if you've written one of these, or perhaps several of these, don't despair. You might have pulled it off. Some authors can take these ideas and spin them into gold. It's just much more difficult to do. What I'm really saying in this video is be wary of these storylines because they're so common, they create a lot of pitfalls that are tough to avoid. 1. It was all just a dream. Now, I don't have trouble per se with dreams. A character telling another character their dream, or a character interpreting someone else's dream. I mean, dreams are fascinating, right? We've known this since way before Freud started analyzing them. They can present a window into your character's unconscious that you can't get at any other way. But it is a problem when the narrator presents what's happening as real life, and then they pull the rug out from under the reader and says, surprise, it was all a dream. That is low-down trickery, and it abuses the reader's trust. Still, some authors argued with me about this one. Just remember that if you do just a dream, the worst place to do it is at the beginning of the story. That's because you're not giving the reader any information before you say, guess what, everything I've told you so far, it's fake. If you do it, you have to do it in the middle part of the book. Lastly, there are no stakes in a dream. Unless this is Inception and the characters can actually die in a dream, nothing real ever happens in a dream, so nothing bad could ever really happen. Real life has stakes, and you need stakes to tell good stories. Now, I will give one exception. If the dream is more of a prophecy, where the character is seeing something that happens in the future, then that's perfectly fine. That's not actually a dream. They are imagining what's going to be real. 2 people talking in a bar. Most of you probably just said, what's so wrong with people talking in a bar? And a lot of commenters said the exact same thing. Now, don't get me wrong, I can think of a lot of incredible scenes set in bars. There's nothing explicitly wrong with it unless you've read 10,000 unpublished stories and books like I have, and I just see it again and again and again and again. And the trouble with a lot of these bar scenes is that they include all dialogue and zero action. Younger, beginning writers tend to love bars because they seem like fascinating, forbidden places. They just become less fascinating when everybody sets a scene in them, and they become soggy with too much dialogue. And let me say, it's particularly a problem with short stories if you set the whole short story inside a bar. Now, if you find yourself thinking, I need to set my next scene in a bar, I want you first to ask yourself some questions. 1, is there a fresher, more original location that I could choose? Ideally, a location where characters can be moving and doing things while they're talking. If not, then go ahead and set it in a bar. But if you do end up changing the location, I think your readers will probably appreciate it. 3, 0 to 0. Does your hero change at all? Or are they the exact same person at the end of the story as they were at the beginning? In general, when your hero goes on a journey, you want that journey to change them in some way. Now, this is the point that actually most authors disagreed with me. The most common objection was, well, what about episodic fiction? Like a detective series or an episodic television show. And that's a good exception. For those, it's perfectly fine to have a hero that, in general, doesn't really change that much. Consider Sherlock Holmes. He's basically the same character throughout all the books. But in general, I see a lot of short stories and novels where the character isn't changing, and the story would be better if the character did change in some way. I'll also say all the commenters brought up a lot of exceptions, and some of them I was like, you sure that character doesn't change? I would encourage you to look for more subtle changes in character. For instance, look at James Bond. We normally would think of him as an unchanging character. Each new movie and book starts with him as basically the same person. He still takes martinis stirred not shaken, dresses debonair, and loves the ladies. But look at a movie like Skyfall. Here we see him getting old and failing all the examinations. We have never seen Bond deal with that type of failure before, and that exposes a new side of his character. And in Casino Royale, after getting betrayed by Vesper Lynd, he's a little bit jaded and heartbroken and wary of new women. Most stories where authors point out and say, this character doesn't change, I can point out small things in that story which do change that character in subtle but important ways. Most of the time that you're writing a novel or a trilogy, you want a character arc over that book or books. And one last thought, if your character changes from a 0 to a hero and back to a 0 again, that is not a 0 to 0 story. That has a lot of character change. 4, the Bathtub Story. A bathtub story is where a character never moves from a single location. In general, it's a dangerous narrative technique to trap a character in a single location and not let them move for the entire story, because the reader gets bored with the lack of location change. But I got a lot of authors disagreeing with me on this one and usually citing specific stories. No Exit is a great example. And Nicholson Baker has a story which takes place entirely inside an elevator. Yes, the whole novel. And it was a fun experimental book. Or look at 12 Angry Men, a story that takes place entirely inside of a jury deliberation room. I think it's key though to figure out how these stories are pulled off. It's because one, they're debating the death penalty for a man, so there's tons of tension, and two, they are arguing constantly, so there's tons of conflict. If you choose to set your story inside a single location, you just have to be very aware of those limitations. You're essentially writing a play. In plays, you're limited to a single location or a couple limitations because they have to change the whole set every time they move somewhere. Part of the glory of the form of the novel is being able to jump between planets and countries and continents and cities through no effort at all. So if you decide to limit yourself to only a single location, you better make sure that your conflict and your tension are on point or the whole story will collapse. 5. The non-human POV twist. This is when you thought you were reading about a human, but surprise, the character is actually a dog. And many authors pointed out how they love stories with animal characters. But I don't have a problem with books with all animal characters. Animal Farm, wonderful. Watership Down with all those rabbits, amazing. The only trouble is when you're trying to pull a cheap trick on the reader. You're pretending that the narrator's human, then suddenly they're a dog or a cat or a flea or whatever. It's not a good plot twist, and it's not half as original as you would think it is. There's a difference between a earned surprise and a cheap surprise. You want surprises that make the reader feel, oh, I should have known that all along, not make them feel like they've been emotionally manipulated. 6. Thinly disguised wish fulfillments. If you're trying to write about the fantasies of your readers and you're speaking directly to them, well, that can work. Sometimes when I read a book, it seems like the protagonist is an alter ego of the author, and the author has made them incredibly good looking and sexually promiscuous, extremely wealthy, and wildly smart and successful. Basically, they're writing this book so they can pretend to be someone much better than they are. Now, some authors left comments that disagreed with me saying, hey, wish fulfillments can be really fun to read. I think they're right that wish fulfillment novels can be fun to read, but I think others can be a little bit cringy. Like you're getting a therapy session with the author and thinking, did you just write down all your fantasies inside a book? I know you a little too well now. Or is the author just showing how big their ego is? Awkward. So just be wary about how much the book is revealing about you as an author. Lastly, number 7, don't make your main character an author. Stephen King has done this to death, and listen, if you are Stephen King, I give you a pass. Go ahead and do this. And it's not like I'm saying nobody should ever write an author character ever again. I'm just saying it's really overused and you should think twice. Essentially, you have to work 3 times as hard if your main character is an author because it's been done so many times already. Also, there are so many fascinating professions out there. It feels like a bit of a cop-out to be like, my main character's profession is the same as mine. Your character could be an underwater welder. They could be a soap maker. They could be a bike courier. I will say there's a clear exception for books that are actually about authorship. For instance, if the main character steals a book from an author who's recently died and then passes that book off as its own, okay, that's an interesting idea, and you can't write that idea without the main character being an author. I'm gonna add one more overused story structure that I didn't mention in the original video. Amnesia. There are 100 times more cases of amnesia in books than there are in hospitals. It's a plot device that manipulates the reader a little bit too easily and too cheesily. I'm a poet. If you do an amnesia story, you have to work really, really hard to come up with an original angle simply because there's so many stories out there. Yes, if you have an idea like 50 First Dates or The Bourne Identity, then that sort of concept will rise above the rest. But if you're just having a character experience amnesia so they can have a fling with a new boyfriend or they can wake up and not recognize their mother, then you probably need to find a more original angle. The real trouble with amnesia is writers use it to get them out of a sticky corner. That's why amnesia happens every other episode in soap operas, because the writers realize like, we have a problem. I know, let's have them forget everything. So don't use amnesia when you didn't plot properly and you just don't know what else to do. Now listen, some of you are going to view these as challenges, and that's okay. You are a rebel, an anti-authoritarian, and honestly, those are good traits to have as an author. You can definitely write whatever you want to. But if you try to break all of these rules at once, come on, now you're just getting a little too ambitious.